All right, welcome to the Perspective Drawing Project. This is part one of a two-part tutorial series. So in the first part, we're going to go over the first project, and then we'll go over the second project in the second tutorial. So perspective drawing, if we go to the next slide here, is an approximate representation of an image as seen by the eye. And this depends on the distance from the viewer, and basically anything that is further away appears to be foreshortened, meaning that the object's dimensions along the line appear shorter than its dimensions in a parallel perspective, basically straight on shot. So for example, if you were to look at railroad tracks straight on, if you're standing over and looking down on it, the lines would appear parallel, but as you look in the distance, the lines appear to converge to a distance, and that distance point is known as the vanishing point. The line, our eye line, basically that goes across, I'm looking at the middle slide here, has what's known as the horizon line. So these converging parallel lines appear to be going to a vanishing point. Even though they're parallel, they never really touch each other, but in perspective they do. So, and here we have a staircase with multiple forms of perspective, linear perspective. At the bottom we have atmospheric perspective, and that's a type we're going to talk about in just a moment here. But there are essentially two types. There's the linear perspective and atmospheric perspective. So linear perspective, again, the objects will recede to points in distance, usually along a horizon line, but also they could go above the horizon line depending on how the view is used. So, for example, if a tall building was, going up and you're looking up at it, you're going to see it go above the horizon line. But here's the horizon line, and again, here's two vanishing points. So the way it works, the construction lines converge and wrap across the forms to create the perspective. And we're actually going to show you how to do this in a moment here. So here's atmospheric perspective, which is basically a change in value pretty much and visible detail. So it includes the color as they recede the distance, depiction of hog, phase, and rays in the snow. As objects recede towards the horizon, they're drawn lighter and with less visible detail. So you can see here the sort of very, very light value to darkest value towards the foreground here. History of perspective has been this whole gradual process of trying to depict perspective on a two-dimensional surface. So it wasn't until the Renaissance that the secrets of perspective were finally figured out. But essentially, artists tried to figure it out throughout history. Here's a Rembrandt etching, or drawing I should say, and he definitely knew perspective. So he was after the Renaissance, but artists before him were trying to figure this out. Here's some of the earliest known forms of art from the Chauvet Caves, and these were discovered in the 1990s, and they're about 27,000 to 32,000 years ago. And they're very realistic representations of animals done on caves from caveman times, but they didn't have real linear perspective of any kind. They did have a little bit of overlap, but they were still drawn mainly from profiles. Ancient Egyptian art has a hierarchy in design. Notice the largest and highest figures are the most important. So the main one in the right corner here, because figures higher up in terms of statue, and the tallest. However, the figures were drawn from this peculiar angle of front and profile combined. So they would show like the front chest, and the shoulders, but then have like the head turned to the profile view, the feet turned to profile view, because they didn't understand how to figure out perspective. And the overall space was relatively flat in the design. There was no real overlapping that happened. Ancient Greek also had this issue of, incredible, beautiful design, but in terms of spatiality, they're very, very flat, lacking perspective. No overlapping shapes and no change in scale, really, to determine the feeling of going back into perspective. It wasn't in the Middle Ages that they started to deal with some perspective attempts, but the perspective and shading was all wrong. But it was an attempt. As you can see, it's just kind of a mess. But they did try and figure out, hey, this is an angle, this goes back a certain way, but it was just, not figured out in any way. Chinese painting in the 12th century had a more orthographic kind of perspective. It was almost good perspective here. actually kind of works out, but it is based on a 60-degree angle or 120 angle, almost like an orthographic view. And then we have Giotto's chapel, which has these incredibly sort of modulated and painted forms of figures were really well done with terms of the modulation of the values. And there was an attempt of some perspective, but again, perspective wasn't quite correct in here. It wasn't until Brunelleschi in the Renaissance that linear perspective was actually brought out. So devised in 1415 by Italian Renaissance architect Filippo Brunelleschi, and later documented by architect and writer Battista Alberti in 1435. He created this book that was Della Pictura, which documented the whole process of linear perspective. So Masaccio's Holy Trinity, one of the most earliest known examples of linear perspective in painting. So you can see the converging vanishing point lines behind the Christ figure here, leading towards the horizon line here. So we're actually, as a viewer, we're actually below the figures because the horizon line also represents our eye level. So that's where the viewer would actually see. So here's Battista Alberti and De Pictura. So the idea here is that you would see this through a mirror and figure out the perspective. So the mirror would basically reflect back and flatten out on a mirror, and you would be able to see the actual lines of the image. And it was an optical trick that was figured out by Brunelleschi and Alberti. So, but the first books weren't published until 1450, but they were composed in 1435. So here's actual example linear perspective where you have the horizon line and vanishing points. Here's another one. Here's one of Leonardo's Last Supper. Here you can see the vanishing point going behind the Christ figure. Here we have Raphael's School of Athens, and notice you can start to feel it and this is again the High Renaissance. You can see the actual perspective going back. So 1 point perspective, you basically have a horizon line and vanishing points, right? 2 point perspective, you have a horizon line and 2 vanishing points. So notice in this design, there's a vanishing point on the right towards the bird and another one going to the other bird on the left, which is a very clever design. This one by Spider-Man by Todd McFarlane has a 3 point perspective, which is very common in comic books. You got the vanishing point going way down below, so we're above sort of have the bird's eye view, known as. If you were flipping it the other way, you'd have what's known as the worm's eye view. But we have essentially 3 points of perspective. One's going down, one's going forward, and one going off to the side there. So this first project in your sketchbook or sheet of paper, you're going to use a ruler and draw in pencil. So you're going to follow the perspective PDF handout for instructions. So I have a handout that you'll be following. You're going to practice a 1 point perspective. You're going to draw 4 or more objects. Then you'll practice a 2 point perspective drawing, draw 4 or more objects, and then practice a 3 point perspective drawing 4 or more objects. Draw only simple forms, add some shading and value to each form, but you don't have to spend like hours working on the shading. The idea here is to figure out the actual perspective, the linear perspective. Try and imagine a light direction and draw and cast shadows for your forms. So here you can see some very simple forms. Light coming from the top right going down, and so you'd have the cast shadow on the opposite side. So that's the idea here, is you want the shadow to kind of go in a direction, and you want it to be fairly flat on a plane. Try not to angle up the shadows. Angling the shadows up too much or down will kind of give you a feeling like it's going up a hill or down a hill. So here's a 1 point perspective example. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4 forms with some little cast shadows. Again, this may take only like 30, 20, maybe even 20 minutes to do something like this. Maybe 15 if you're really fast at the shading and stuff. So it doesn't take too long. 2 point perspective will take you a little bit longer. This one may take 30 minutes or so, maybe 25, depending on some people are pretty fast with perspective if they understand it pretty well. But notice the cast shadows that are off to the side here, and then 3 point perspective. This one will take a little longer. Again, your forms don't have to be quite as complicated as these. They can be a little simpler. But the idea here is you have 3 vanishing points going each direction. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a moment. So here's the perspective handout. Again, it gives you straightforward instructions. Begin by drawing a horizon line, add a dot for the vanishing point, and then basically you draw a square down below. It could be above, and then you connect each point to the vanishing point. So you try and draw a line from each point, and then you draw parallel lines. Remember, parallel lines are lines that never cross each other. So you want a parallel line from the top to go across, and then a parallel line on the side to go across. Then you could essentially erase the lines. I'm not concerned if the lines are erased, because you could just shade the form and kind of get the idea. So basically here you see the same process happen with the simple forms becoming 1 point perspective at the end. 2 point perspective works pretty much the same. You have a line, 2 dots, and then a line down below. Make sure the line down below isn't touching the horizon line, but it's a little bit further between the two. And then you connect the top and bottom of that line to each vanishing point. Okay. Then you draw 2 parallel lines, and you can determine how far out you want those lines to be. And then you do what's known as the crisscross, where you have the top of each line go to the opposite vanishing point. So the red top to the blue top, you can see crossing over. And you basically can then repeat this process with any additional lines and have multiple forms happening throughout. So again, 4 or more. For a 3 point perspective, you have a line, 2 vanishing points, and a line drawn below, all pretty much the same as a 2. The only difference is there's a dot at the bottom for the 3rd point. So again, you have your lines going from the top of each line going to the vanishing point. And then the only difference here is what's happening in this step here, which is instead of 2 parallel lines, the parallel lines now go to the 3rd vanishing point. Then you have the same crisscross that happens, and voila, you have a 3 point vanishing point. So if you're going to do the bird's eye view, it would be the opposite. The point would be at the top instead of the bottom, and then you would flip it the other way, essentially. Try and draw 4 or more of these forms for each project. And let's go back just one more time to look at the examples here. So we got, remember to add your cast shadow, draw 4 or more forms in the 1 point, 4 or more in a 2 point, and 4 or more in a 3 point perspective. So that's it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll cover the main project, which is much more involved. Until next time, see you soon. Cheers.